Next, from Lincoln, Illinois, Congressman Schock holds a town hall meeting with constituents and takes their questions on a new farm bill, the growth of federal spending, and the need to cut entitlement spending. This runs about 40 minutes.
Ray Gillen, I'm a farmer from Warren County, Illinois. My question is, do you see any support for energy crops in this Congress?
Energy crops?
Yeah, like biodiesel, etc. Support, you know, are like
pennycress.
Yeah.
I was going to say all crops are energy crops, right? I think, look, some support, absolutely there's some support. I'm a supporter. The challenge, as was defined earlier in our conversation when this program started, is educating people who may not understand what agriculture means to them because they may not have a farm nearby. And so part of our challenge with biofuels is getting people to understand what's happened as a result of the boom in ethanol, what's happened as a result of new biofuels coming online, like pennycress, like an increase in soy production, what that means in our lessening of dependence on foreign sources of energy. And there's a reason why, if you put up the graph of importations of foreign sources, that number's going down. And we're really on a path in the next 20 years, a realistic path, of us actually becoming completely independent from Middle Eastern oil. Our number one supplier of oil is Canada. Number two to that is Mexico. And while we may not become independent as a country, certainly in North America, and our dependence on Middle Eastern oil has dramatically reduced because of the progress we've made on biofuels. So our challenge really is to educate my colleagues who will beat their chest and stand up on the House floor and talk about the need to become independent energy production country, but at the same time not want to support the kind of policies that create some kind of a safety net, some kind of certainty, so people, individual investors, as well as our friends in the financial sector, banks, are willing to loan money to be able to go out and build the kind of production capacities for these new renewable fuels. So, it's tough, but I would argue it's been tough. I mean, it's always been tough. And the fact of the matter is, we got the facts on our side. I actually would argue that the argument for biofuels today is arguably easier than when we were arguing with hypothesis. We argued that if you allowed for the production of ethanol, we would reduce the dependence on foreign oil. We can now point to the fact that because of ethanol, we have less importation of foreign oil. We can show that because of biofuels, people aren't going to starve. I mean, people used to make those arguments before we had the production. Now we have the production of biofuels, and there's not been a huge catastrophe. So, yes, it's tough, but I don't ever think that a tough debate is an excuse to run away. And I think the facts are on our side that it's an important component in America's energy portfolio, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. And certainly crops like the one you're here today promoting, pennycress, is a great new addition because it's a winter crop. It's really the second shift for farmers to be able to plant the crop when their land would otherwise be dormant, to make additional money, but also to produce an energy producing crop. Was that the ad you were looking for? Yeah. Yes. So what's your question? I don't want to cut you off. I want to have you, but if you got a question, I'd be happy to answer it.
The question is the same as an editor in a farm magazine very recently put it. He said, we've got a system now where when we go back, when we got legislation being considered, we got people from the urban areas, like this gentleman from Oklahoma said, that are trying to come to terms with urban congressmen on this issue. Okay, you got guys over here wanting food stamps, you got people over here wanting direct payments. He said, well, we couple that. And I understand that we have less and less urban or rural congressmen, but what happens is we get this whole system contaminated when we have people saying, okay, I'll give you food stamps if you give me direct payments?
So what's your question? Well, the question is, can we get rid of the welfare on both sides of the aisle? I would say this. I think it's extremely difficult. I would never say impossible, but I'd say it's extremely difficult to separate the food stamp portion from the ag-specific portion of the farm bills. Start with that, number one. Number two, as a non-urban congressman, I guess the rhetorical question I would ask all of you is, do you think our country should have some form of a food stamp program? Beyond the answer to that question, which I think most people would say there needs to be some type of a food assistance program for the poor, the natural political reality to that is these two are married together, because if you're not in the consumption, you're in the production. And if you're in the production, in other words, it makes sense for why they're put together. I understand the realities of if you're in agriculture, you don't want to have anything to do with the food stamp people. And if you're in the food stamp industry, they don't know why they got to deal with the ag policy. I mean, I've had these conversations with urban representatives who say, well, my food comes from the grocery store. And it's not a joke. That's really what they say. Okay, so there's a reason why these two get put together. Now, I can stand up here for an hour dissertation and talk to you about how screwed up the food stamp program is. I mean, Chairman Lucas just described a few of the fixes that he's trying to implement, and you would think that we were stealing food from starving babies to suggest that just because you get energy assistance, you automatically qualify for food stamps with no regard to income or assets. So there's been reforms that we've been trying to advance to try and reduce the cost of that welfare program, that cost of food stamp program. But within the ag portion, which is what you really targeted within your remarks, the direct payments, look, I've been advocating to get rid of direct payments because I think that's good policy. And quite frankly, politically, that's what all my farmers tell me they want. But I'll tell you this also, equally direct. I go to Washington, D.C., and I sit across from a Frank Lucas, and I say, Mr. Chairman, we need to get rid of the welfare within the ag portion of the policy, which is direct payments. And all my farmers want is a safety net. All they want is crop insurance. He says to me, what do you think crop insurance is? That's a welfare program as well. Because the reality is, if I had the crop insurance agents in here, and I had the CEOs of their motherships, they would tell you right here with a straight face that they can't do a national crop insurance program without federal government backing them up, without federal subsidies, without federal taxpayer dollars going towards it. So part of this is everyone wants less government except for their government. Whether you want a crop insurance program, whether you want direct payments, or whether you want a food stamp program. And the nastiness of the sausage making is the leanest sausage you can. And trying to look at the food stamp program and say, all right, if we're going to help people who are poor and hungry, how do we make sure the money's going to poor and hungry people? And if we're going to do a crop insurance program, how do we make sure that there's not a lot of fat within that crop insurance program and it makes the most sense for the producers, but also for the insurers? And the same thing with the direct payment program, which I'm telling you, as honest as the day is long, I can vote for a farm bill tomorrow that doesn't have direct payments in it. But if I had a district like Mr. Lucas or others that have cotton and peanuts and the like, they'll sit here with a straight face and say, you know what? Our assistance is no different than your assistance, meaning crop insurance, and we want to spend our money differently. So the beauty of my job is if I had to wait for a perfect bill, I'd never get to vote on a single bill. And that's why he talked about some members of Congress, not just members. There's members that I've served with well, I haven't served with them, but they've been there for as long as I've been alive. And they love to give fiery speeches on the floor and then vote no. And they're on the far right and they're on the far left. but they never get anything done. And so what we're trying to do is get the best possible accomplished. And I think we're making progress given the circumstances of who's in the White House and given who's controlling the Senate to get a bill out of committee. I mean, think about this, a bipartisan vote that cut about $16 billion from the food stamp program. Because even people on the far left can't hardly argue against people getting food stamps that are wealthy, that have significant assets, and that haven't shown there's a need. So I think we're making progress. If I were king instead of congressman, I could do what you want to do a lot quicker. But fortunately or unfortunately, our structured government requires a majority of 435, and sometimes that's like herding cats. And so trying to get 218 out of 435 to agree is a struggle. I would agree with you that turnover is good, and I think what Chairman Lucas was suggesting is not that he doesn't like working with the freshmen or sophomores, but that it takes more time to get it done. In other words, when half of your committee was not there 2 years ago, you're now educating a classroom of folks who, many of whom don't necessarily come from ag districts or have an ag background, and so it's harder to pass the bill. But this bill that he described passed that same committee of over half of them being new in overwhelming margins. So it's just taken longer. I know there's been frustration of people in the room saying, why is Congress waiting until the last minute? Well, like a lot of Americans, we operate based on deadlines, number one. And number two, when a third of your Congress is new, it takes longer to educate people about what SNAP is, what the direct payments mean, and what a federally insured crop insurance market looks like and why it makes sense.
Just quickly, I agree with Nan 100% that federally subsidized crop insurance is no different than direct payments. The problem is we have so much graft and fat in that insurance program. We have counties, for example, that have no disaster or no high-risk land. And there is high-risk land, so people are reaping benefits on that. You know, and it really shouldn't be. It's not actuarially sound. You know, so that, I can't understand why we can't come to terms with that, that the money that would have gone to direct payments, if it goes to the crop insurance program, same thing, it's welfare. If we had insurance, and that's another thing, I think it all comes from one comment that that gentleman made, that he acted like, what would we do for food? Excuse me? Do you think that this good farmland in this country wouldn't get farmed if there were no direct payments or if there were no crop insurance? It certainly would. That was in the brain. Somehow or another, it would get farmed. I guess what I'm saying is, and if we lowered that amount of money that we get from the government down to nothing, prices on inputs would come down too, wouldn't they?
Let me just ask you one question. Are you suggesting that we should have a federal crop insurance program with no federal dollars?
I'm saying that if you had nothing, no federal crop insurance program, would that land get farmed?
Well, let me ask you this. Would there be a crop insurance program federally without a federal crop insurance program?
Well, maybe not.
And so, are you satisfied with no federal crop insurance program?
Yes, sir, I am.
Okay. Yes, sir.
No, I'm just agreeing.
Okay. Yes, sir.
I question about our transportation system in the United States. You know, several years ago, we were going to talk about the locks and dams on the Illinois River, and you live in Peoria, and we got money for islands.
Sure. I agree with you. He's asking about the funding of our locks and dams and the need to upgrade them. We have actually some of the worst locks and dams in the nation in my congressional district. So if and when we actually pass a funding bill for WRDA, the Water Resource Development Act, which was passed before I came to Congress 6 or 7 years ago, and Congress passed WRDA with no money. So we have this great framework for what we need to do for locks and dams, but there's no money to fund it. I've actually supported an initiative that the barge operators want, which is actually a diesel tax as a revenue stream that they pay basically as a cost that they're willing to bear as operators to get the upgrades on the locks and dams that they need so that they don't have to worry about one of these collapsing and their way of life being damaged. 90% of the jet fuel that gets burned out of planes in O'Hare, so think about 90% of the planes taking off, theoretically, their fuel comes from barges that go up and down our river system in Illinois. I tell you that because it's the number that's important to me when I go talk to the dozen congressmen from Illinois who live in Chicago, because they think locks and dams only matter to farmers. And I tell them very quickly that if they think that if one of these locks collapses and all of a sudden they got a shortage of jet fuel and they got a airport they can't operate, they're going to be in a world of hurt. So the problem is there's not a wherewithal. It's the reason why we had to screw around so long as we did with the transportation bill. It's why we have a 2-year highway bill for the first time since Eisenhower was president. Every year we've had every time we've authorized a 5-year or long-term highway bill, it's been a 5-year bill. Bill Clinton passed one, Ronald Reagan passed one, George Herbert Walker Bush, George W. Bush, all had fully funded 5-year highway bills. This is the first time we have it. And the reason we haven't been able to pass a 5-year bill is because nobody wants to step up with the leadership in D.C. to show how to pay for it. I mean, you all know we know how to spend money in Washington. The problem is, because of the House changing hands, we're no longer willing to spend with debt. The first 2 years, we spent a ton of money with debt. Now you have one unit of government saying, we'll only spend if we can pay for it. And so that's what's thrown a big kink in the administration's desire to do a lot of things, whether it be farm programs, whether it be transportation programs, whether it be all kinds of environmental programs. The initiative I was supporting that some of you read about would have fully funded our highway program for 5 years if we would have sold all of the offshore leases and allowed for drilling of natural gas on public lands and used the royalties the federal government gets from that and funneled into the trust fund. That would have filled the gap between the money we have and the money we need, and we could have funded a 5-year transportation bill. But it's the same thing with locks and dams. There isn't anybody out in D.C. that understands this issue that's going to tell you they're not for building locks and dams and upgrading. It's how you're going to fund it. And not everybody's willing to stand up and say, you know what? Let's get behind either a diesel tax increase, let's get behind a user fee for barges, let's find a way to come up with the revenue to pay for it. And I'm out there right now, but it's kind of a lonely spot. But that's really the challenge we're in right now. I don't think anything's going to happen until after the election's over, and I don't really know what's going to happen after that, because we have 4 years to deal with this. And you know, I'm as tired as you are of hearing about elections. You know, everyone uses excuses of elections. Well, you know what? In my job, I'm up every year. I mean, I got a 2-year contract. By the time I get sworn in, I'm already running for the next one. So if I thought about the election all the time and how I voted and positions I took and what I said, I wouldn't say anything. I wouldn't vote on anything. I mean, at some point, I think all of you recognize you're not going to agree with me all the time. I mean, if you said you agreed with me all the time, I'd tell you you're lying. But I think at the end of the day, what you want me to do is make decisions. Make the best decision I can make with the information I've got at the time and try and move the ball forward and advance our country. And locks and dams are one of them. I'm trying to be a leader on it. If you got a solution for how we can fund it, by God, I'm here to listen. Yes, sir.
In light of your comments regarding spending, the one concern I have, and a lot of us in this room would have, is with a $16 billion deficit, I don't see a way of paying for that except one, and that's debt tax. Because that's the only one I see that has sufficient money to pay for it. We can't load our kids and grandkids. That's impossible. And I guess my question is, what do you see as the solution for paying off the debt of spending that we've incurred?
I'm sorry, you're saying the only solution you see is the death tax? Okay.
And don't get me wrong, that may be a viable solution, but we've all played the game. It's almost over, and it wasn't part of the game that we grew our wealth from, or were able to protect it from.
The death tax. Well, I don't think death should be a taxable event. And I also believe that rich is relative. I mean, who in here is rich? I got a few honest ones, right? Okay? Rich is relative. And so when I get into this debate with my colleagues in Congress, they say, well, you know, the rich, we ought to be able to tax the rich. Well, who's rich? I mean, if you own a home in Logan County that's worth $250 grand, you probably got a pretty nice house. If you have a home in Los Angeles and it's $250,000, you're probably not living in a very nice neighborhood. Okay? If you have farm ground in Illinois, you have 100 acres in Illinois, you're probably not getting a whole lot out of 100 acres. If you have 100 acres of citrus down in Florida, you're in a different situation. So rich is relative, and I think it's a very dangerous road for us as a country to go down to decide what wealth is a level at which we ought to deserve to take half of it when we die. Number one. Number two, the basic economics of the death tax doesn't make sense. First of all, it represents 1% of total revenue to the federal government. I can show you studies that show we as a population spend more each year in accountants, attorneys, and financial planners. And for those in the room, I love you, but we'll find some other thing for you to do. But we as a country spend more on accountants, attorneys, and financial planners each year in true dollars to avoid the estate tax and the federal government actually collects in the estate tax. So it is a poor use of dollars within our economy to try and spend the money circumventing a law in which we don't collect that much money. And third, it forces a poor use of investment and capital in our economy. What happens when an estate tax goes into effect? Oftentimes it forces the sale of that entity, whether it be a family farm or in many cases a small business. And whether that business is a trucking company, whether it's a manufacturing business or the like, rather than the capital going into growing a business, rather than capital going into expanding the operation, the capital is then used to go to the federal government. Now, if the federal government were a good creator of jobs and sustainable economic growth, I could perhaps side with that argument that the money is better off going to the federal government, who will then use it to grow the economy, who will then use it to create long-term sustained economic growth. I don't believe that. And so if you believe as I do, which is the private sector is the best way to create long-term growth, then you want to keep those monies in the private sector. So this is, you know, and sometimes I have trouble with my colleagues because they think that I'm running roughshod for rich people. No, the reality is that it's basic fact that whether it's true dollars we collect, it's not that much, whether it's the fact that it incentivizes the wrong behavior. And unfortunately, many times, when you look at the people that are hit, there's also studies of who it hits. The estate tax tends to hit people under the age of 55. And the reason for that is because most people who are older than 55 know about the estate tax and they plan for it. And they have either insurance policies or trusts set up, ways in which to divert the liability. By and large percentage of the people in America who get hit with the estate tax are families who have somebody die unexpectedly, somebody who gets sick unexpectedly, and they have not exercised proper planning or the tools available to circumvent the estate tax, and they're the ones who are stung by it. Now, to your other question, which was how do you get out of the debt of $16 trillion? First thing is you stop spending. We have gone from $10 trillion in debt from the time that President Obama was sworn in to now $16 trillion in debt. So in 4 years, we've gone up $6 trillion. Okay? Do you feel better as an American? Do you feel like you got that much more out of your federal government? Okay? So the problem we have right now is that people will say, oh, gee, you know, we're at war, we're this or that. We have entitlement programs that have exploded. And whether those programs are food stamps or actually the programs that nobody really wants to talk about are Social Security and Medicare. Programs that were set up when people were having a lot of kids and people were dying at a relatively young age. And the problem is that that scheme, if you will, doesn't work anymore. Because y'all didn't have enough kids and you're living too long. Okay? And so we have a huge funding gap between the money going into Social Security and the money getting paid out, and the money going into Medicare and the money going out. And until we have leadership willing to stand up and say, here's how we're going to fix Social Security and Medicare, we're going to continue to have deficits as far as the eye can see. 65 cents out of every dollar that we spend right now in our country goes to support Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. 65 cents. To put that in perspective, in 1970, which wasn't too long ago, in 1970, 5 cents out of every dollar went to Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. So from 1970 to today, we've gone from 5 cents to 65 cents. And it's one of the reasons why our military is getting squished. It's the reason why our education funding and our transportation funding and all the rest is getting squished. And every year we don't do something about Social Security and Medicare, a larger and larger piece of that pie gets eaten up just to support the unfunded liability in those programs. By 2044, which is, 30 years from now, if we don't do something, in 30 years from now, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid will eat up 100% of the dollar we're paying in taxes. Obviously, we can't afford to allow that to happen. We'd have to disband the military, we'd have no transportation funding, and the rest. So that's really the challenge. The House has put forward a budget that does Medicare and Social Security reform. We've been beaten over the head because the occupant of the White House doesn't like what we propose. That's fine. I'm used to people not liking what I think. But tell me what you think. Tell me what you want to do. Tell me your proposal. And we've got no countervailing proposal for Social Security and Medicare other than the one that the House has passed. And so if there's anything that I would ask you to do to help me, it's to hold your senators' feet to the fire, pass a budget, tell us what you're going to do with Social Security and Medicare. Don't tell us what you don't like about this proposal. What's your proposal? And whoever you're going to support for president, I have my opinion, but you can support whoever you want. Find out what their proposal is to save Social Security and Medicare. Because if we don't do anything, the programs blow up. Doing nothing is a decision, and it leads to a very, very ugly consequence. Yes? Yeah. He's asking about the Paul Ryan budget proposal. Well, if Paul Ryan were here, he would tell you it's not his budget proposal, it's the House budget proposal. What I was just doing in responding to this gentleman's question was basically mentioning the fact that we've actually put a proposal forward. It's not a perfect proposal, but it is a proposal. And it's actually a proposal that passed with more votes than any budget that's passed in Congress in the last decade. So you think about all the budgets that passed under Clinton, all the budgets that passed under George W. Bush, no budget has passed the House with more votes than the budget that just passed this last year. That's got no movement in the Senate, but it passed this year in the House. And it did the unthinkable. It did Social Security reform and Medicare reform. Why? Because a lot of those freshmen that came in said, we're here to fix it. We're here to make a tough decision. And some of my colleagues who've been there for a while say, well, we don't want to upset people. And, we don't want people to think we're taking away Social Security and Medicare and on and on. We say, wait a minute. If you're going to be honest, everybody knows these programs are going broke. We got to show some leadership. We got to show how we're going to fix something. So that's what our budget did. Now, I don't have an hour here to go through, and we're not going to put you to sleep with all the details of how you fix those programs, but let me just give you a few facts. With Social Security, the it's a lot easier to fix. Why? Because it's a defined benefit. You can make $1 billion, you can make $1 million, your benefit from Social Security is the same. The Democratic proposal is basically to increase taxes to fund the funding gap in the current Medicare system. The Republicans' argument against that is we don't think Medicare is a very good arbiter of cost containment. They basically just pay. And we think there needs to be a third-party administrator, just like there is for health insurance, who says, you know what, physician, that's not a legitimate expense. You know what, physician, maybe that isn't a good prescription to be given out. And there ought to be some arbiter there, like a third-party administrator. We also believe that Medicare should be done just like our own health insurance company as members of Congress. We think the wealthier you are, the more you should pay, and the poorer you are, the more subsidy you should get. So, obviously, this is where I agree with the president. I don't think we ought to be subsidizing Warren Buffett's health insurance. Right now, he gets to enjoy Medicare just like everyone else. Well, I think if you have a higher income, why would you run it through a federally subsidized program, which is Medicare, and increase your taxes to pay for your $90,000 funding gap? If I'm lucky enough to be a wealthier American when I retire someday, I'd rather control my $90,000 spread, theoretically, than to allow the federal government to control my money. So, I'm trying to keep this very simple, but you know, that's the gist of the solutions. Okay, a couple of last questions. Yes, sir.
What about the speaker calling the farm bill? That they won't call it until after the election.
Well, I believe, I had a long conversation with the chairman, and he believes that we will get a vote on it in September when we're back. I think that when members of Congress go back to their district, they're going to hear that we need a farm bill. Now, the question is whether enough of them hear it. It is a real important question. But I think that we're going to get the support we need to pass one. I hope it's before the election. I hope it's before September 30th when the current one expires. But you know our challenge is that that other big piece of the pie, which is 80% of the budget of the Farm Bill, the food stamp program, it continues no matter what we do. So, again, not to take it too far in the weeds here, but we're trying to get a bill passed where there's only 60 members of Congress whose district demand that we pass a farm bill because they're by and large affected by it. So you got over 300 members of Congress whose districts are affected by the farm bill directly as a result of the food stamp program, and that portion of the bill continues whether the bill passes or not. And then we're trying to reform the food stamp program, which means you get all the inner city folks that represent inner city districts all exercised and excited, because they don't want to see the program get cut back at all, and they figure, you know what, no farm bill's better than that farm bill, because no farm bill continues the status quo. So, this isn't about, this is where I think it's hopefully helpful for all of you to understand, this isn't really about debating ag policy. That's the sad situation we're in. You know, people say to me, why can't you get members of Congress to realize you need to do an ag farm bill before the end of September? This is really a much bigger discussion about how do you get people who don't think that it matters if we pass a farm bill to move one, and how do you get them on board with some of the reforms we need to do to the food stamp program and the like, to want to do it when there's other people in the Congress who are getting pretty exercised that their constituents think that we're somehow hurting them. So I think we'll get it done. I'm going to push for it. I'm on the whip team with this guy, and we're going to try and round up the votes before the election. Yes?
How many congressional working days are left once you get back to the
You'd ask me that. You know the answer to this, don't you? I think there's like 3 or 4 weeks. We have so typically August is the month that Congress is not in session. This month we actually work the first week of August because the Democratic convention is the first week of September. So normally we would come back to DC the first week of September, right after Labor Day. We're off that first week of September because it's the Democratic convention, and so we work first week of August in exchange for having off the first week of September. So we don't actually come back to DC until the second week of September. So you have the second week of September, the third week of September, the fourth week of September, and then the first week of October. And we're in every day except for the Jewish holidays, the Rosh Hashanah, which are the 17th and 18th of September. So I'm not good at adding those up, but less than 20. Okay, yes. Well, thank you too. He asked why the Senate cannot be forced to pass a budget to do their job, because it's the law of the land. There's 1970 Budget Act that requires that Congress pass a budget. Congress has passed a budget every year since that Budget Act, except for the last 3. Unfortunately, the enforcers of the laws of the books are the courts. And so until someone were to challenge the Congress, really Congress is held accountable to the laws it passes by the electorate. And so it's up to the electorate to demand that their elected representatives pass a budget. I mean, there's no enforcement agency that will go into the United States Senate and lock them up and say you're not coming out of this chamber until you pass the budget. Even though they have passed a bill, there is a law in the books that says a budget must be passed by this date each year. The only enforcement mechanism really is the electorate. We'll keep asking them. And be sure to vote. Okay. One last question. Yes. I thought this was an egg, son. She asked what my position was on high-speed rail. Well, where do I begin? Two things. First, I've been over to Europe and I've been to China. I've been on the TGV in France. I've been on the LEV in China. TGV in France goes, I believe, around 200 miles an hour. The LEV over in China goes over 300 miles an hour. It's pretty slick. There is no, so when somebody says to me, what do you think of a high-speed train? I've been on a high-speed train, and I kind of like it. None of the high-speed corridors that have been identified by the Transportation Department are suggesting high speed on par with what's in Europe or in China. Number one. And the reason for that is cost. To build the LEV in China, they have a little bit lower wage rate than we do, was $1 billion a mile. If you look at the landmass of the United States of America, and you look at the landmass of Europe, and you look at the population density of Europe, and you look at the population density of the United States of America, and someone suggests that someday we're going to be like Europe with high-speed rail run all over the world, or all over the country, I would suggest either we're going to have an even more enormous deficit than we currently have, or they're drinking Kool-Aid, because the reality is you cannot run a LEV train that goes 300 miles an hour from Chicago to St. Louis at $1 billion a mile. It ain't going to happen. So, what are they talking about? They're talking about upgrading the rail lines right now, for example, between Chicago and St. Louis, to allow for the capacity of the train to go up to just over 90 miles an hour. What that means is you're going to shave off, I don't know, every time they do a study it comes out with a new number, but roughly 20, 25 minutes off the time that it takes to travel from Chicago to St. Louis. So far, they've appropriated and will be spending $1 billion to do the engineering and pre-construction work for that route from Chicago to St. Louis, just over $1 billion on that route. My belief is, I don't think that money is warranted given the amount of speed increase that you're going to get. I'm not sure you're going to get a dramatic increase in ridership because of 20 additional minutes. And third, I would say that every high-speed train in the world is highly subsidized. The operation, not just the cost, but once it's operating, every time that train runs in Europe, every time the train runs in China, it's subsidized, so it costs. So every time you put a new train online, you're basically creating an unfunded liability for the federal treasury to have to come up from somewhere. You're doing it at a time that we don't have motor fuel tax money to actually pay for the roads that we need. And finally, I would just say, I'm not sure there's the public support that the president claims there is for it. And the reason I say that is because the United States Congress has never appropriated a single dollar for high-speed rail. The only money for high-speed rail that we have spent in this country was contained in the stimulus bill. The stimulus bill was drafted at 11 p.m. at night and filed and passed at 10 a.m. the next morning. Nobody read it. And all the money that was in the stimulus bill was left at the discretion of the Department of Transportation. And that is when the White House then announced that there was going to be $8 billion for high-speed trains. Congress never voted on that provision. Congress also refused the request of the White House when the president's party controlled the House and the Senate for the first 2 years. He had appropriation requests to fund high-speed rail. None of those appropriation requests were honored. The Democratic House and the Democratic Senate never appropriated a single dollar for high-speed trains. So again, I'm not being partisan, I'm just pointing out the fact that I don't think there's even support within the Democratic conference for this type of a liability to put on the shoulders of future generations, because simply there's not a way to pay for it. Theoretically, do I like high-speed trains? Absolutely. Do I enjoy riding on them when I'm in another country? Sure, at their expense. But the reality is, because of the population density of our country, because of the land mass of our country, because of the indebtedness of our country, and just quite frankly because it doesn't make sense, I don't think it's a wise use of our tax dollars. Okay. Thank you all for being here, and it's an honor to be your representative out in Washington, D.C. I mean that sincerely, and I look forward to hopefully seeing more of you around the district as I spend August traveling my 20 counties. And if I can ever be of help, if you're ever out in Washington, D.C., either out with the Farm Bureau, the corn producers, or the soybean producers, or the pork producers, or the cattlemen, or, you know, I don't know, just out for a trip, give me a call, come see me. It's nice to see normal people in Washington, D.C. Thank you all. Have a nice day.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.